Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Dr. Josh with Digital Hammurabi, and starting our second stream in our marathon today. We just did a stream on Sumerian grammar, lesson 5, and if you haven't seen that, please check it out. For some reason, that's like the most popular thing on our channel right now is a Sumerian grammar, and I see William kind of chuckling because it's like, yeah, William's taking Sumerian. He knows this is like, why is, but hey, I'm excited about that because see, I love Sumerian. Obviously, everybody should love it. So, but yeah, definitely check that out. We did a review of lesson 5, and this is the second stream of the day, and we are very, very honored to have Dr. William Reed with us. And I'll briefly introduce him, but I'm going to let him give his background. But William and I, Dr. Reed and I, went through Hopkins. Much of our time together at Hopkins was spent fighting through Akkadian, fighting through me letting him fight the Ugaritic battle. And if Dr. Lewis is watching, I'm sure he already knows. Yep, he already knows. Josh was just going with what Smith said. So it was Smith, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
Smith.
Yeah. So I see. At least I remember that much of
Yeah.
that. So you're Ugaritic. No, but I'm very, very excited to have William here. Dr. Reed graduated. It was earlier. Was it earlier this year that you
Yeah.
defended?
Well, so I defended February 2018, and then I guess technically, like sometime in May is when they issued my diploma.
No, man, you became Dr. Reed when they walked out. And through your tears, maybe I'm just projecting because that's what happened to me. Through your tears, after being absolutely destroyed in your defense, they say, What? Congratulations, Dr. Bowen." So yeah, I probably shouldn't admit like that I cried, but I did. I'm okay with that.
There's no shame in that.
Dissertation defenses are they're rough, but I guess they're worth it. So
Yeah, I guess so.
So yes, Dr. Reed has his PhD in Hebrew Bible and wrote his dissertation. And if you want to talk about that a little bit, that'd be absolutely fantastic. It's actually a really amazing dissertation on weaponry in the ancient world. So I think we can. William, would you be okay with us finding the link and making that available to people to read?
Sure. I think it's up on the library. The library website, or it should be, because you can put a hold on your dissertation.
Embargo, right?
Yeah. I elected not to do that, mainly because I thought, well, you've done this research, and it's put it out there, let other people use it, even though there's things like looking back on it that of course I would change or want to adjust or correct, especially after the defense. But it's better just to have that out there so that people can start using it.
Oh yeah, I mean it's amazing. Of course we and then I promise we'll start. But it's funny when you write something like a dissertation, you go so deeply into this topic, and you realize that there's so much that you don't know. You don't realize how much you've learned and how much more you know about this topic than probably 95 to 99% of the populace. So then you're like, oh, there's so many things that I don't know, but you know so much more about it than everybody else. So. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Well, I'm going to let Dr. Reed introduce himself and give us, if you don't mind, a little bit of background, just so they can kind of get to know who you are. But then talk about your educational background and what qualifications that you have. And everybody, be forewarned here. I've known Dr. Reed for a long time. He's a very humble guy, so everything that he says, you can safely multiply it by 10. So if he says, yeah, I know a little bit about X, he knows 10 times more than that about X. So
yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but educational background. So I got my BA in religious studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So there I studied mainly New Testament, but focusing on like fringe Christian, like early Christian groups. So I did Coptic and like Gnostic studies with Zlatko Pleše. So that's what I did there, but it was kind of a broader program. And then I did my master's degree at the University of Washington in Seattle under Scott Nagel. So I chose that school because of there's a scholar, a New Testament scholar, Michael Williams. He kind of wrote like one of the definitive books on Gnosticism called Rethinking Gnosticism. So I went there primarily to study with him, but I applied to the NELC program, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and which he is like associated with, but technically he's in religious studies. It doesn't matter. But my advisor, you know, after I got accepted, said, "Was there any way you could learn some Hebrew over the summer to, you know, it'd really help you kind of get going quickly in the program?" And I thought, hey, why not? So the only place offering Hebrew over the summer was Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which I went to and mainly kept my mouth shut for fear of being labeled a heretic. Like one class we had, the whole class discussion was whether the vowel pointings, the Masoretic vowel pointings, were divinely inspired or not. So yeah, if you know anything about Hebrew, that becomes pretty funny. So I went there, and then I kind of split my studies. So I continued to do like Gnosticism for like my first year there, and Hebrew, Ugaritic, that sort of thing. That was right when Codex Chakos, the volume that has the Gospel of Judas, the famous Gospel of Judas, came out. So with Michael Williams, we read through the whole thing in Coptic. It was pretty fun, and so. But as time went on, my interest, you know, went more and more to the Hebrew Bible. So I kind of stopped taking as many New Testament classes. So yeah, we took Hebrew, and we did a whole year of Ugaritic, and we did Aramaic. I took Middle Egyptian there, and Akkadian, and then got my master's degree, got accepted to Hopkins. And there, you know, I'm part of the Hebrew Bible Northwest Semitics program. So again, like 3 years of Akkadian. I did Middle Egyptian again with Dr. Jasnow. We did Sumerian with Anna Glenn, and then Dr. Del Nero later. And oh, I forgot, in my master's program, I also did some Hittite, but it's not, I'd barely say that I know any Hittite. And I've had Greek from way back. So yeah, and then my dissertation started from my interest in divine weapons. So if you say you read the Ugaritic ball cycle, ball is given 2 maces by Kothar Wahasis, who's like the craftsman god, and they have names, and it's kind of like an incantation that's performed over them. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And I'd also noticed some similar kind of stuff in some of the Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions. And so I was interested in looking at that from a biblical perspective. And what ended up happening was that I noticed that the most frequently attested weapon associated with Yahweh is the sword. And of those places where the sword is connected with Yahweh or associated with him in some way, like the vast majority of them occur in the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah. So it kind of grew from being just an interest in weapons to kind of what they were doing in this kind of either like slightly pre-exilic / exilic context. And so I ended up using trauma theory to kind of approach why these weapons were playing such a significant role, and how both Ezekiel and Jeremiah were drawing on like the older Israelite kind of weapon related motifs, but then also stuff that's kind of pan Near Eastern, right? To kind of shape the rhetoric of how they characterize the exile.
Nice.
So
Well,
I think that covers it. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, basically, what you've said is you know everything. So
Yeah, right.
I think that's fantastic. And see, I know you, so I know it's true. Um, so let's for those that are watching. And by the way, there are 24 watching right now. Thank you all
Fantastic.
very much.
Thank you.
If you haven't hit the like button, please do so. And I'm sure most of you have subscribed. But if you haven't subscribed, please do so. That would be absolutely fantastic. It really would help us out. So for everybody that's watching, just so we're all starting at the same level here, you've talked about a lot of Near Eastern languages, right? You've mentioned Hebrew, Ugaritic, Aramaic, Akkadian, Sumerian. Can you just, and of course, then you got into Egyptian, which I really should have taken much more of an interest in. But as you remember from our Egyptian history cycle, I should have just taken more of an interest in that. But could you just for a second, maybe in 2 minutes, sort of give a basic overview of why it is that we study all these languages, right? Because I'm sure that most people watching do know, but just so that everybody's on the same page, why in the world would you learn Ugaritic? Why would you learn Aramaic? Why are these languages important to the study of the Old Testament or to the ancient Near East?
Right, for sure. The easiest, like the most straightforward one to explain is Aramaic, because of course parts of the Bible are actually, the Hebrew Bible are actually in Aramaic. So starting, probably into the Neo-Assyrian period, but certainly hitting a high mark during the Persian period, Aramaic was kind of the lingua franca of the whole ancient Near East. So we have lots of inscriptions and documents and that sort of thing in Aramaic. That give us some context, right? So even if you're, say, interested in pre-exilic, like monarchic Israel, right? Some of their rivals, their opponents are the Arameans. We have Aramean inscriptions that talk about their conflict with Israel. So being able to read those kind of helps you kind of evaluate some of the biblical sources. How truthful are they being about, this battle with Damascus, right? That sort of thing. So there's that level. Also, there's a number of Aramaisms in the Bible itself, right? We said that there's Aramaic in the Bible, but the Bible continues to be edited throughout the exile and afterwards. And starting in those periods, Aramaic becomes, the primary language of the people. And so you find Aramaic influence in the editing and writing of parts of the Hebrew Bible. So Aramaic's the easiest to explain. Ugaritic, which is, depending on when you want to date some of the biblical text, as little as 300 years prior, maybe as much as 600 years prior to the writing of the Bible. One reason, there are many to study Ugaritic. One reason is that it's very similar to Hebrew, and sometimes we learn about the meaning of expressions or words that we weren't sure of from their Ugaritic context. Also, the Ugaritic texts give us kind of an insight, right? They worship Baal and El and that sort of thing, and of course, these are the deities, especially Baal, associated with the Canaanites, right? The historical nemesis of Israel. So you get some insight into the religion of, the people that, at least according to the biblical text, right, are the antagonists. But in addition to that, people just reading the Ugaritic text have noticed lots of like parallel motifs, imagery, symbolism that's used both by the Ugaritic mythological text and the Hebrew Bible, like a lot of the storm god imagery used for Yahweh, like him riding on the clouds like a chariot, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's almost word for word the same thing that we find in some of the Ugaritic myths categorizing Baal. So that gives you more kind of it fleshes out the milieu, right? The environment that the Israelite authors were writing in, and maybe some of the things that they were drawing from for inspiration, knowingly or maybe even unknowingly. This might be widely disseminated amongst the culture, right? Akkadian, also kind of straightforward in that Judah and Israel both have dealings with the Neo-Assyrians. So there is some cultural contact between that. Obviously, there are references to Israelite kings in some of the Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions. Was it Shalmaneser's Black Obelisk mentions Jehu, right? So again, filling out the historical context, acting as a check, right? We know about Sennacherib and Lachish, right? That sort of thing. So his besieging of that city. So you can take the biblical text and what it says, especially about what the Assyrians are doing, and then you can compare it with the Assyrian texts themselves. But again, especially once you get into texts maybe dating from the exile, right? Like specifically Ezekiel, a lot of people, scholars have noted Akkadian vocabulary that's kind of seeping into Ezekiel. So he's writing in Babylon, well, not in Babylon, in Babylonia, and he, there's a lot of arguments that he's kind of influenced at on some levels by the culture there. So understanding not just the Neo-Assyrians, but the Neo-Babylonians, but even like going back kind of what influenced them and what texts were important to them and kept being used in scribal education into the Iron Age becomes really important for trying to understand the environment of the biblical authors.
Good. Okay. Actually, that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
I think I took more than 2 minutes.
Sorry. No, that's okay. No, I think it's good. And so what we're getting ready to talk about is, I've entitled this stream like "Who Wrote the Bible," right? And that's sort of a general. It's a big topic to talk about, but I think that what Dr. Reed is going to discuss, what we're going to engage with here, at least in a significant way for the Old Testament text, is really trying to answer that question, right? Trying to at least come up, what are the viable options, right? So. If you're watching and I really think it would be great for people to see this, particularly in our community. So if you could share, however it is that one does that, share the link or whatever to get some people in here, that would be fantastic because I really think this is going to be a really great interview. Also, Megan is watching, or like she's in the live chat. I've been trying to look over to the right, but I have my laptop here. It's hard for me to follow that. But if you have questions for Dr. Reed, send them to Megan. We're going to have a definite Q&A session at the end. Dr. Reed has very generously allowed us to do that. And believe me, you want to tap into that resource. And I suspect at the end of this, we're going to ask him to come back again. So get your questions into the live chat to Megan. And Megan, of course, if there's something that you think would be very germane to the discussion, you may see her pop her head in, or maybe she'll text me. I've got my phone here. Maybe she'll text me a question if it's really important. But Dr. Reed, if we could, just to sort of give an overview here, maybe the thing to do is for us to talk about you and I have had discussions in the past month, and I think it's sort of surprised you some of the things that we hear in the not in necessarily this community, but in maybe some of the more fundamentalist Christian sides of the community, what people think about the Old Testament text in particular. And so I'd kind of like to, if we could, lay out just very briefly, and if you want, I can do it. So that we can sort of set the scene for what how the biblical text presents itself internally. So the history that it presents itself. So, and I'll just do it real quick. If you want to jump in and add anything, please
Sure.
do so. But basically, Genesis is laying out the creation of the world, then the fall of mankind, the population of the world. Then God, of course, creates a bottleneck through Noah in Genesis 6 with the flood. 6 through 9. And then the world populates again, and God disperses the people out at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And it's starting at the end of Genesis 11 into Genesis 12. He starts to call out his own nation through Abraham. The rest of Genesis is taken up with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the patriarchs. And ultimately, they end up down in Egypt. which is where the book of Exodus opens up. They're enslaved in Egypt. Of course, Exodus is the story of Moses bringing the people up out of Egypt and into the promised land. So the second half of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and of course Deuteronomy. All of these books are from an internal perspective, right? From how, if we took them simply at face value, we would say these are telling the story about how they were given the law, how they wandered through the wilderness, how they came up to the boundaries of Canaan, how the boundary of Canaan at the River Jordan, how they sent spies in. 10 came back saying we can't take it. 2, Caleb and Joshua, some of the greatest names in the world, I think, frankly, came back and said, no, we can take it. So Moses dies. The book of Joshua begins. Joshua goes in and they have a conquest of the land, right? They conquer a lot of it, not all of it. The book of Judges begins after Joshua's death, and they're supposed to go up and take different parts of the land, and they don't do it very well. And so the tribes end up in the book of Judges in the land of Canaan, of Israel. But they're sort of intermingling. There's some patches. There's some groups that have been left in there. These Canaanites and Amalekites and all these other that are left in the land. And these judges, God raises up these judges to deliver the people from their oppressors, sort of periodically. That period ends with the monarchy, the united monarchy, under Saul, then under David, under Solomon, and then of course it is divided under Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the north and the south. And then, of course, each of those kings have, kings that follow them in the north and in the south. The north is always bad. The south is usually bad, but not always bad. And the north is taken away into Assyrian captivity in 722. They're conquered by the Assyrians. And then, of course, ultimately the south is conquered by the Babylonians. But that's sort of, would you say that's a fair representation from an internal perspective?
Yeah.
Okay. So because that's the internal perspective that the text gives, when you come at this, like I did for most of my life, from a very fundamentalist, inerrancy, perspective, and my hermeneutical approach was, if the text says it, that's exactly how it is. To the point that, I've mentioned this on the stream before, but when I wrote my master's thesis, one of my presuppositions was it is presupposed that Moses wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch, right? So that is the approach that many people take in the more conservative side of this community, right? But it was shocking to me when I started to study this at Hopkins that, wait a second, that's not really how people view this, right? Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? And there's this whole field of study is to try to determine not only when these books were written, but who wrote them, and what context they were written in. And so that's sort of a lead-in to what I'd like to talk about with Dr. Reed today, because Dr. Reed is teaching a class right now at it's at UMBC at the University of Maryland, right? That you're teaching the Deuteronomisitc history course.
No, that one's at Hopkins.
Oh, that's at Hopkins.
UMBC is Israel in the Ancient Near East.
Oh, okay. So you got somebody good on when he teaches at Hopkins. That's a good thing. So maybe what we could do, could you, Dr. Reed, just for a second, because I think there are a lot of people watching that would be interested in this, and you don't have to go into great detail. And of course, I don't want you as a true scholar here, I don't want you to go into areas that you don't feel comfortable talking about. But could you maybe go into just a very general overview of what are some of the big ideas, the big scholarly ideas that are debated that you would consider to be the viable options that we have to choose from, right? So, for example, I know I'm talking a lot and I apologize. Would you say that there is a consensus view at all in the scholarly community that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament?
There is a consensus that he did not.
That he did not. Okay. Yeah. So, and I agree, right? I think that's also my experience in the scholarly community. So, if he did not write it, would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about what some of the primary theories are? Not that if you agree with them, one or the other, but maybe what some of the major theories are about the
Sure.
formation?
So the classic theory, which had gone out of favor but is recently back in, is the documentary hypothesis, which posits that just for the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books, we have 4 different sources: J, E, P, and D. That is actually quite old, from the 1800s, popularized by Julius Wellhausen, but certainly he was not the first. Anyways, the division is based in part on the names of God found in Genesis. So this is in part, right, there's Elohim as the name for God, and that's where you get the E source, and Yahweh, which in modern English we would spell with a Y, but in German you get Jehovah, and that's where you get J, is another source, right? And this is based in part on Exodus 6, 2, and 3, where God appears to Moses and says, to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, I revealed myself as El Shaddai, but to you I reveal my name, Yahweh. So that got people thinking, but wait a minute, if you go back and read the patriarch narratives, they mention Yahweh all the time, and not just like in the narrative, right? You could excuse the omniscient narrator, so to speak, inserting the name of Yahweh who he knows, but actually the patriarchs like say the name Yahweh,
right,
in a number of, and pretty much all of them do at various points. So that led scholars to thinking, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. So maybe there was a version of this that originally just used Elohim for the name of God, up until this point in Exodus. And then they found that, hey, look, we got a lot of duplicate stories in some of these accounts, right? So Abraham has to lie about his wife Sarah being his sister twice. Then his son Isaac does it once. Obviously, the classic example is the 2 creation stories in Genesis 1, verses 2 through 3. So they started noticing that, hey, you can sort these out, these duplicates, and you'll see that there are E duplicates that use Elohim, and that there are J duplicates.
So if I could pause you for just a second, sorry. So you would say that the scholarly consensus is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are separate creation stories?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, just wanted to...
No, that's fine. So that's where you get the J and the E, and they found these kind of J and E based on like common language and thematic concerns. They trace them all the way up until the book of Deuteronomy. So that's your J and E source. Your P source is they also found another kind of thing that didn't quite fit into that J versus E dynamic, that seemed to be mainly concerned with priestly matters, cult, the temple, right? The laws concerning the priests and like what they would wear and that sort of thing. And so that was considered a priestly writer, hence P. And then none of those seemed to be very present in the book of Deuteronomy, which seemed to have its own kind of language and style. So that's the D source, the Deuteronomic source.
So when generally, and of course, like J is earlier, and so I don't want you to be specific, but can you give like a general time frame of when these sources would have been compiled, even from the earliest, Wellhausian? When did they consider, even at a very early time, that these books would have been composed, or these sources would have been composed?
So the classic view, I mean, obviously J is earliest, then E, then D, then P. Although D and P sometimes switch back and forth depending. Right. So J originally was put somewhere around the 10th century, United Monarchy. E was somewhere in the 7th to 8th century. And then D, which we'll get into more, was usually put in the time of Josiah or shortly thereafter. And then P was usually considered exilic, so either in the Babylonian exile or maybe slightly later. So that's the classic version from like Wellhausen, I think generally speaking, people would shift a lot of that forward in time now if they continued to have to follow the documentary hypothesis. So maybe Jay would be closer to the late monarchy as opposed to the earlier monarchy. And then other things would kind of collapse. I think E would probably be somewhere around there for those who still think that there's an E. Since that classic viewpoint, there's been a lot of development, especially towards like during the 90s and early 2000s, under the influence of European scholarship. Most scholars for that time period, looking at the sources closely, they began to say, you really can't tell a big difference between E and J. And so E and J kind of merged together. And so what you end up with is usually what's called P or non-P, although some people will call non-P J. John Van Seters calls it J.
So let's just pause for a second, just so that, you know, the professor in me, the teacher in me wants to make sure everybody's clear. We've got 43 people watching right now. Thank you all very much. If you like what you're seeing, please click the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And again, if you have questions for Dr. Reed, please put them in the side chat. And Megan's, I think she's out there tallying them up. But so that we're absolutely clear for everybody here, when we think about these sources, be there 4 sources like JEDP, or whether there's a P and not P, and then the Deuteronomist, what we're talking about here, and again, please correct or develop what I have to say, but we're talking right about individual traditions, be they originally oral or just originally written. They're individual traditions that are being pieced together. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they're usually considered. So the classic documentary hypothesis uses kind of this, there were original stories that basically covered almost the same kind of material, right? So J would be a story from the creation to them getting or about to enter the land. E would be a similar source, right? Covering the creation to the entry into the land. And so at some point, someone took those 2 sources and kind of wove them together. And instead of deleting any of the material, right, to iron out inconsistencies, they just put things right next to each other. So that's why you have the, 2 Abrahams, kind of disguising his wife as his sister, and why the 2 creation stories are right next to each other, things like that. So they wove them together to try and make one complete story. And sometimes scholars would attribute that. So when Samaria is destroyed by the Assyrians, it's assumed that a lot of northern Israelites fled to Judah to escape deportation. And they might have brought their like history with them. And then so you have their history, and then you have like the Judahite version, and then in some sort of act of solidarity, they tried to put them together. That's one theory. Now, when you get into the P non-P stuff, it's similar. They're woven together, but then that's usually considered exilic when that happens.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I've seen a couple of questions, and we'll deal with these at the end, unless I haven't read them in detail. But I just saw there were some questions. If Megan thinks they're pertinent again, sweetheart, please feel free to text them to me. But of course, one of the difficulties that we have with the Hebrew Bible in particular, and of course also with the New Testament text, is that we don't have any of the autographs, right? And that's one of the amazing things, as Dr. Reed well knows, about working with Akkadian and Sumerian texts, because we do. So if anybody's interested in learning about the ancient Near East and going into it for a master's degree or for a PhD, come over to the dark side of Assyriology, because you can work with the originals, right? You can work with the autographs. Anyway, just a little plug there for Assyriology. But so when we look at, somebody could ask themselves, some people could ask themselves, well, now, how do we know? Like, okay, so it looks like they're a little disparate, but, do we have any evidence in the ancient world of two separate traditions being put together. And yes, we do, right? And you can see this actually quite a bit in the Mesopotamian material, particularly when you have Sumerian sources that are being brought together into Akkadian epics or Akkadian texts. They get combined, they get developed. So, but the reason that is easier to see, and for example, Jeff Tegay wrote a book on this about the Gilgamesh epic, and you can see this sort of, editing together of the texts for a completely new text that's giving a different theological message, I suppose. We know that because we have the original tablets in Sumerian, and then we have the later tablets in Akkadian, so we can compare them, right? We can see how they get what gets put in, what gets taken out, what gets changed when it goes in, those sorts of things. So we don't have that with the Hebrew Bible, unfortunately, because, well, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and not, you don't have to talk about the sources, but so you've talked a little bit about how some of the duplicates, right? Those doublet stories. Could you develop that maybe just a little bit for the viewing audience? Like maybe take one doublet that you feel comfortable with and sort of explaining, how we know that those. But for example, it could be argued, and people have argued that, well, now Genesis 1 is giving like a broad perspective in some ways, and then Genesis 2 is developing that. Of course, I would disagree with that for any number of reasons. But, is there a doublet that you feel comfortable talking about to say, look, we can tell that these two things are individual sources originally that are being put together?
Yeah, there's a number of hallmarks inside. I don't know if there's one particular doublet in my mind that I could point to necessarily. I mean, the one that I keep going back to just because I used it for my UMBC class was the Abraham disguising his wife first for Pharaoh and then later in Canaan, which it seems completely redundant. Like, what are the chances that he would do the exact same thing twice? And remember, there's each of these doublets uses a slightly different vocabulary. There's certain vocabulary associated with one and not the other, and that's similar with the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 through 3, right? That it's not just that there are two creation stories, but that they have different kind of vocabulary, different kind of emphasis, and it's not. You don't necessarily have to put them in contrast with one another in the sense that, I think in the ancient world it was possible to have multiple different versions of like a story or an event or whatever, and that since this is kind of a belief system, they're like in the minds of a believer, they're both true. But as far as like they're both written by the same person to like, echo the themes in the others, that's harder to argue because they seem quite distinct.
Yeah, because one of the things that I've noticed as I go through this, as I've gone through this over the years, when I say going through this, talking to people about these doublets, is that there's always this tendency, and I just saw it in the live chat, like somebody trying to say, well, isn't it possible that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are written by the same person? They're just reflecting it in different ways. No is my answer. There's a certain amount of I think statistical probability, and I'm not a statistician in any way, but statistical probability, after you see, the 40th example of a doublet, and you have to ask in each case, well, isn't it possible that it could be? And you have to find some, some small rationale that makes it so it could be possible that the same person wrote these. That you have to start to say, well, now, wait a minute, maybe we need to change our model when we look at this. Maybe it's not necessary that one person wrote all these things, right? Maybe that's just well. So, I mean, what would you say about that, Dr. E? Would you say that that when you look at the amount of doublets, for example, that appear, that scholarly consensus would be, yeah, absolutely multiple sources, at least two, P, non-P. Or would you say that it's pretty evenly balanced in the scholarly community, that it could be written by one person, and it could be from the sources?
I think the consensus is definitely and almost overwhelmingly that they would be different authors. First of all, you'd have to step back and say, we have to be careful about talking about authors and authorship with ancient texts, because what we consider and think of as authors and they did are not necessarily the same things, right? So
Right.
no one has signed any of these texts and said, it's not even in the narrative. I mean, granted, Moses speaks in the first person in Deuteronomy, but nowhere does it say, and I, Moses, am writing these words so that everyone will know them, and that sort of thing. I mean, the tradition that Moses wrote the first 5 books is there for a reason, because it's there's a reference to the Torah of Moses in Deuteronomy, so it makes a certain amount of sense. But he never in the text claims to have written what we now think of as Genesis through Deuteronomy. So one, we should be careful, because even if we have a text that we feel like is generally speaking, like maybe we might consider mostly monolithic. Let's take a prophetic text. Like, prophetic texts are usually easier to date. There's usually a prophet involved who's like the author, and that becomes easier. And if you take, say, Ezekiel, right? I'd say mostly there are some people who divide different parts of Ezekiel, but generally speaking, at least the first like 25, 26 chapters of Ezekiel, and certainly like 40 and on, whereas the New Temple vision is often considered later. But even if you just ignore that, the rest of Ezekiel is usually considered to be, the work of probably someone named Ezekiel living in, Babylonia, that sort of thing. But, is it written by Ezekiel, or did we have like a number of like people copying things down in like a Jeremiah Baruch version, right? He's got a scribe to write it for him, or a school that collects all his like prophecies and sayings during his lifetime, but then maybe after he's dead, that's when they, he passes on, and then they say, these are really important, we should put all these together.
Oh,
but
we
then
see this sort of in the book of Kohelet, right? In the book of
exactly. So, I think it's tempting to read your own present modern context into some of these and think about one person sitting down and writing everything, or one whole book. But generally speaking, it's probably more of a collaborative process. So that said, I'm wary of identifying any one single author. Secondly, to go back to the issue of the doublets, and whether or not they could just be an author kind of repeating himself. Certainly that's within the realm of possibility, right? Possibility versus probability. But when you look, especially in the Pentateuch, at the doublets, and then you see that certain doublets all have the same language, all use the same kind of terminology, and have like a similar outlook and theme, right? That they're emphasizing. And then you notice that for almost every doublet, it fits along one track or the other. That gives you more confidence in saying, well, all right, if it was just one doublet, or all the doublets didn't really work together, or they were all just random, then you could maybe say that someone put it all together, or wrote the whole thing. Although then you'd still have to worry about issues of consistency and coherence. But the fact that a lot of these doublets reflect a similar view, right? And that you can track that view through, the first 4 books of the Pentateuch, gives strength to the idea that it's not just that someone repeated themselves or told the same story or similar story twice. It's that there seem to be 2 different traditions about this story that have been put together.
Yeah. All right. So that's thank you. That's actually fantastic. And I want to, before, because you said something that was great. You said the first 4 books of the Pentateuch, which is fantastic, a fantastic segue into the Deuteronomistic history. But before we go there, so we've talked about JEDP, right? this documentary hypothesis that was sort of made popular by Wellhausen. and we talked about the European, briefly started to talk about the European scholarship. What is the big difference with the European scholarship? Could we talk about that very briefly before we move on to the Deuteronomistic history? Because I think for people watching, that's, there are a lot of people that are interested. There are some people that I've met that have read Farewell to the Yahwist, for example. So what would you say is the big difference between American scholarship and European scholarship in this regard? So
American scholarship for a lot longer has held on to the notion of that classic four-source hypothesis. It fairly early into the process, E was kind of regarded as not necessarily a complete source, and a lot of what was once considered E has shifted over to P. So that happened early, and people still held on to a notion of E, although limited, right? Maybe not a true source, but someone like adding things here and there. But once you get to European scholarship, that kind of breakdown only gets stronger. So they're looking at the text and saying, the stuff that was once called E really fits more with P, and so it makes a lot more sense just to, looking at some of the intricacies, because, not only did they divide it into four sources, if you know the history of the theory, not long after, they're dividing it, there's J1, J2, J3, E1, E2, E3, right, etc. And so it just gets...
This half of this verse goes with P2.
Yeah. It's like, or... sometimes it's even like a fourth of a verse. It's like these three words are E. This next part is P1, and then this latter half of the verse is like J2 or so, whatever. Yeah. And it just stretched credibility, right? People were just like, yeah, but can you really like micro divide this much? And so there was a reaction to that, and people started looking and saying, all right, well, let's see what's our strongest division, what's super clear. And everyone could agree that you can really tell the difference between P and non-P. The P language is completely different. The emphasis on cultic matters is different. P is usually responsible for anything that's like dating and genealogies, all that sort of stuff is like in P's wheelhouse. So they just took a step back and said, let's be a little more cautious or a little more reserved in what we can say we can divide up in the text. I mean, everyone agrees that it's edited, right?
So can you give an example of that, like in Genesis or somewhere that this P and not P, that while, people have reacted to this subdivided verses, but they would say, look, this we know is P, this we know is not P, like from a...
Well, I mean, Genesis 1 is considered P, Genesis 2 through 3 is not P. I'm trying to think of another example.
I assume the flood story.
Yeah, that one's divided between, right? So that's the division between the animals and whether they're taking 2 or 7 of each aboard the ark. And then the reasons for the flood, yeah, that's usually divided amongst P. P being, the source of 7 animals, so that you have sacrifice, that sort of thing. That's classically divided between P and non-P. Okay. Again, once you look at the doublets, some of the doublets that at one point were considered E are now considered P, just because of the changing kind of nomenclature of the division. Yeah, I'd say it's again, language-wise, it's usually pretty clear that there are 2 different versions going on, and then details, right? Like the flood story.
So to sort of sum it up before we move on to the Deuteronomistic history, there's been a lot of attack in conservative evangelical Christian circles or fundamentalist circles, and I remember attacking it myself. I didn't understand it, of course, but of attacking something like this documentary hypothesis by Wellhausen, JEDP, and people, I remember, latched on to the fact that people were reacting to it in the scholarly community, and what they were latching on to was this strict division of J1, J2, J3 all the way down, they're reacting to that, and they're saying that that's probably not accurate, or that's probably doesn't reflect reality. Therefore, all of source criticism should be thrown out, and then we should rely, on the traditional, the tradition that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Would you say? I know the answer, but would you just want everybody else to hear you say it? Would you say that that is the approach that we should take? That if the documentary hypothesis in its original Valhausian form, or even the neo form of it, it is not considered to be accurate by scholars in the field, that we should then do away with the idea of multiple sources and go back to a Mosaic authorship?
Yeah, no, I don't think we should do that, and I don't think that's warranted by the evidence. So even if you see the kind of like arguments about scholars about what counts as what source, or the breakdown of the classic theory, even when you come into the people who argue for the classic theory or the new version of it, the neo documentary hypothesis, if you put them versus like the European scholarship that just wants to say P non-P, first of all, they all agree about P non-P, right? That even though they might disagree about some of the other things, all the scholars agree about that much. And even if you have questions like, putting my cards on the table, my instruction in my master's program, my advisor there, he's not a fan of Wellhausen, doesn't like the documentary hypothesis. He's not coming at it from a religious fundamentalist perspective. But if you asked him, does that mean Moses wrote the Bible, or does that mean that the Bible isn't edited? He'd say, no, of course not. It's most certainly edited. And if you read it in the Hebrew, it becomes very, very clear that things like get interrupted and then pick up again. And there's been some tweaking and changing with it. So there's clearly editing. The only thing he would say is he wouldn't be so certain that we can easily untangle that knot, right? So much like the discussions about Gilgamesh, I mean, in that case, we have a lot of the sources. We have the sources that were woven together to make the Akkadian epic.
We get to cheat.
Yeah, you get to cheat, and and you don't get to cheat with the Hebrew Bible, at least until someone discovers something amazing. There's no cheating, so we just have the end point. And so it's kind of trying to unravel that knot, and it's just about creating the most likely hypothesis to kind of explain the discordant elements within the Hebrew text. But no like non-conservative or fundamentalist scholar would suggest that the text isn't edited, or that or revert back to Mosaic. I think that's Mosaic authorship. I think that would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So I don't want you to say anything, obviously, that you're not comfortable with. I know I keep saying that, but Megan has texted me, and something that was germane enough for her to text me that's going on in the live chat. So are you simply concluding this, that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch because you are an exceptionally liberal scholar, and that if we were to ask actually a reputable conservative scholar, that they would say, no, we have overwhelming evidence, very clear evidence that it was written by one author? In other words, are you doing this because, are you coming to these conclusions, or do you think that the majority of scholars in the field of Hebrew Bible, that you have a PhD in? That was for the audience, not for you.
Yeah, I figured.
And I say this, I know I'm a little disjointed in what I'm saying here, but I say this because, I have a master's in theology. I've been reading Hebrew for a very long time. I have a PhD in Assyriology, and my minor was in Hebrew Bible. And I feel very comfortable commenting on the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And I would very quickly defer to Dr. Reed and I know that he would disagree with me doing that, but I'm okay with that. So, Dr. Reed, in your opinion, do you think that you have a liberal bias? You hate God, and this is the reason that you are coming to this conclusion? Do you want to speak to that at all? You don't have to.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't believe it's a liberal bias. But if you did ask like a conservative scholar, right, from a fundamentalist like background, they might argue for Mosaic authorship, but they are the vast minority in the field of scholarship. And if you go to like the scholarly meetings, like at SBL, so that's the Society of Biblical Literature, or any of the conferences, that's not a view that's ever really represented. I think there's a number of issues, right? I mean, one thing to note, and I brought this up very briefly, which was just to say that the tradition that Moses wrote the Pentateuch is traditional. It's not like necessarily spelled out explicitly in the biblical text, in the Hebrew Bible. There's no place where it's like, I, Moses, am writing this text right now, and that sort of thing. So also, if you want to, depending on when you want to date the Exodus, which is a whole other can of worms, the language of the Hebrew Bible, when you compare it to what inscriptional Hebrew that we have, is pretty much standard Iron Age, 8th to 6th century BCE Hebrew that we have from inscriptions. It fits that language period. If you wanted to put it back further, and we do have parts of the Hebrew Bible that seem older and more archaic, a couple of them, Exodus 15, Judges 5, right? It would be strange because the language is definitely that of like the monarchy period. So if Moses was writing all this, it doesn't fit with what we know about ancient Hebrew. It doesn't, and ancient Semitic languages.
Just so everybody knows, because I think that's a fantastic point that we need to be very clear about here. Moses, the Mosaic period, let's say we date very late, right? Let's say the Exodus is dated as late as people that believe there was an actual Exodus, right? What would you say would be the latest that we could date that?
Latest would be, I'd say, on average, probably 13th century. Some would put it into the 12th. Okay. As like you're having a problem because the Merneptah Stele sets kind of a hard line at 1207 BCE, where Israel is in the land, and so that's why a 12th century would be kind of problematic, because it would be the Exodus actually takes place after when Israel is supposed to be in the land. But some people might argue that like what comes to be, or the Exodus tradition, right, that gets incorporated into Israelite identity might have come that late. Sure. Certainly no later than that, because then you're encroaching upon the United Monarchy. But 13th century is.
So then if Moses, let's just go, because it's 1 o'clock. We've been going about an hour, and I don't want to keep you longer than I told you I would. And I have so many things that I want to ask you, and I won't. I won't. But I will ask you to come back on if at all possible.
Okay.
Because I think people love you. We have 52 people watching.
Wow. That's great.
Which is pretty good for us. And thank you all for watching. If you haven't hit the like button or you haven't subscribed, please do so. And again, I told you this was going to be good. Dr. Reed is he's just a treasure trove of knowledge. And I know he doesn't believe me when I say that, but he really is. He's fantastic. So if in fact the latest that we can date the Exodus, so which would be the period of Moses, and you're saying that linguistically, the Hebrew of older sections, what we consider to be older sections, Judges 5, as you said, would date to the earliest. You were saying the United Monarchy.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, some people want to put it like slightly before. There's, again, with everything, there's a range.
But there's a pretty significant gap.
But that would be like more like 10th century is usually, and even if you wanted to say it was Mosaic, right? Let's for the sake of argument, just say, okay, I would be willing to grant that Exodus 15 and Judges 5 exhibit language that I could imagine being concurrent with the 13th century BCE.
Okay.
Right? That language is different enough and distinct enough and like weird enough compared to the rest of the Hebrew Bible that all you could argue from that is that Moses wrote Exodus 15 and Judges 5, if you wanted to go that far, and that everything else is Iron Age Hebrew, like much later Hebrew. This is, I mean, you've done tons of Hebrew. You know that reading those is very different from reading like Kings or Genesis or anything.
Definitely.
And it's closer to reading almost Ugaritic in a way, which makes sense. And then, we see similar developments in like Aramaic, from Old Aramaic to Imperial Aramaic to Biblical Aramaic.
And we see it in Akkadian. We see it in Sumerian. I mean, you see it in language. I mean, this is how this stuff works.
Language changed. That's why, Shakespeare does not sound like modern English.
And that's why we can't say anymore, ain't in the dictionary. So ain't a word. I don't know if anybody actually said that in the listening audience, but I may have just dated myself by saying that. Okay. Well, thank you. You've entertained is not the word that I'm thinking of. Indulged is the word that I'm thinking of. But I asked you to come on here to talk about the documentary. I mean, the Deuteronomistic history. So I do want to talk about that.
Yeah, let's get into that. I have a feeling it's partly my fault for being loquacious and
what you have been saying
asking me
is fantastic. And again, if we got 27 likes, which is pretty good right now. So if you like what's going on here, leave a comment saying how great Dr. Reed is, and like the video. So we talked about the formation sort of the first 4 books, and you mentioned that, as I said before, the first 4 books of the Pentateuch. What's different about Deuteronomy, and how does that lead into this Deuteronomistic history? What is that exactly? What are we talking about?
So the Deuteronomistic history, simply put, is a theory by Martin Noth from around the time of the Second World War, that the books of Deuteronomy through 2nd Kings, so Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, constitute one entire work written by a single individual, according to Noth, during the Babylonian exile, as a way to explain Judah's fate, right? So it's basically someone sitting in Babylonia saying, how did we get here? How did we screw up so bad that now we're in exile? And so this is, at least according to Noth, his take on that, right? And he's had at his disposal a number of historical sources that he's crafted together. Royal annals, that's especially prevalent in the 1st and 2nd Kings material, but then some other conquest narratives from Joshua. And that what he has done is he's taken all this material, structured it in a way to kind of get to the point that he's trying to make, i.e. that Israel is constantly turned away from Yahweh and hasn't done what they should have done. And he punctuates this story by a number of speeches given by prominent individuals. And these speeches, they cover pretty much similar themes. They have strikingly identical language, and they all kind of emphasize the same point. And so you have, say, Moses' speech in Deuteronomy 31, Joshua's speech in Joshua 12, and then in 23, 1 Samuel 12, which is Samuel's speech about kingship. Then you have Solomon's speech after he builds the temple in 1 Kings 8, and then kind of a reflection on the fall of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings 17. So these are all speeches by prominent figures, right? Moses, Joshua, Samuel, Solomon, etc. That cover similar themes, have strikingly identical language and topics, and it's focused, right? So there's that layer. Additionally, all the kings, starting with the United Monarchy and going forward, are judged according to standards that we know from the laws from the book of Deuteronomy. And that's been the fact that famously, Josiah finds the book of the law in the temple. I mean, traditional ancient commentators thought that must have been the book of Deuteronomy, because
could you talk about that story for just a second, the biblical story of Josiah finding the book of the law?
Yeah, so they're cleaning out the temple and they find this book, and that it's read to Josiah, and then he says, "Oh my goodness, we've been screwing up this whole time," and he tears his clothes and repents, and he decides to enact the laws that he found in the book. So he tears down all the high places. He focuses worship solely in the Jerusalem temple. He cleans out the Jerusalem temple of any like non-Yahwistic idols or whatever that were there, all these kind of astral deities. He enacts the Passover, which hadn't been celebrated, at least according to the Second Kings account, since the time of the judges. And then Josiah's reign ends, and then the little narrator comes on the scene and says, "And there's never been a king like Josiah before or after, that did what God loved." And the language there echoes the language used of Moses in Deuteronomy, right? That he's in a unique position to God. So this is far back, even before the Deuteronomistic history, scholars thought that the book of Deuteronomy was linked to Josiah discovering, or the discovery of the book of the law under Josiah, because all the reforms he enacts are reflected in the book of Deuteronomy's laws, but not the Pentateuch itself, the Tetratuch, let's say. So the first 4 books. And so Noth's idea was that this person took inspiration. He's like looking back, this author of the Deuteronomistic history is looking back to Josiah, and it's like, that was the right time. That was the time when everything was good. And so all the kings are judged according to whether they centralize the cult in Jerusalem, and whether they destroy the high places, and whether or not they worship non-Yahwistic gods. So that's Noth's theory. Subsequent to that, people have kind of modified and tweaked and played around with. So he said it in the exile. Other people have. So one of the first revisions was the Cross School. Frank Cross thought that, wait a minute, this really privileges Josiah in a way that doesn't privilege any of the other kings. Remember, there's never been a king like or since Josiah. No one's been as great as him. He's the only one who completely obeys, some of the laws in Deuteronomy, and he's the best king. So that, Cross's thought was, in addition to that, there's a lot of this until this day language scattered throughout. So they'll tell you about a place or like an artifact, like the iron bed of Og of Bashan, and it's like, and you can see it. It's there to this day, right? So that to this day has to reflect like a monarchic period when they're still in the land, at least.
Wait a minute, it doesn't refer to like 2000.
No, I don't think you can still find the iron bed of Og of Bashan.
But but wait, it's in the Bible. Sorry, I'm just teasing. Go ahead.
So Cross said, so instead of putting it in the exile, it was actually written under or shortly after Josiah to justify his religious changes, and then was updated later by someone in the exile after, because obviously Josiah doesn't keep the bad things from happening to Israel. They still, or Judah specifically, they end up going into exile. And so Cross's thought was later some kind of disciple or person who adhered to this view has to kind of bring everything up to date to the exile. And that's where you get inserts after it praises Josiah for how great he was and there was no one like him. Then there's this, but Yahweh wasn't going to turn away from the evil because of the things that Manasseh had done. And so this pinning everything on Manasseh is placed in the mouth or the pen of the second exilic author. And Cross notes that he wasn't as sophisticated as of a writer because, there's no big speech about the fall of Jerusalem. There's no, big reflection on on any of the events really after Josiah. And so he's just kind of touching up and bringing up to date. So that was the Cross School. Then there was also a Göttingen school. So this is European scholarship, where they see 3 layers, all kind of variations on exilic. So there's an original exilic version, the Deuteronomistic history, but then there's a nomistic editor who adds in the stuff about the law. And this is apparent in Joshua 1, because in Joshua 1, after Moses died, Joshua gets charged to take over the conquering of the Canaanite peoples. And then God says, you know, have courage and be strong and go out and do this thing. And then it says, and it repeats, have courage and be strong. Make sure you do everything that's written in the book of the law, you know, and then it goes on about the law for another verse, and then it kind of returns to, and then go out and conquer. And so famously Smend said, well, that doesn't really fit, because he should just be able, you know, it's about the conquest. This not time or place for like Torah study here. So there must be like a nomistic redactor in the exile who's writing and saying, well, okay, but Torah is really important, and we want to make sure to put that in all the like major figures study Torah.
So to be clear to everybody, nomistic comes from nomos, for the Greek for law.
Law, right? Yeah, he's interested in law, specifically Mosaic law, of course. And then there was Walter Dietrich, a student of Smend, came up with another source or a redactor called DTRP, P standing for prophetic, and he's the one who added all the kind of prophecy material in Kings. And like if you think about the Josianic destruction of, like, Josiah actually goes to Bethel and destroys the altar there. Well, after Jeroboam sets up the altar, a prophet predicts that, oh, there's going to be someone who's born who comes, and his name's going to be Josiah, and he's going to totally wreck this altar. And so the idea was that this redactor was interested in kind of showing how everything was predicted by the prophets and came true. And so all those kind of like predictions, and then this happened in this date, you know, to fulfill the prophecy, that stuff is all that redactor.
Which is one of the, not to like break away from this too much, but it's one of the reasons that I think scholars find the failed Ezekiel prophecies, 26 and 28, about Tyre and Egypt, so compelling, because they're not later redacted.
Yeah.
Right. They're sort of left in place as failed prophecies. And so anyway, it's interesting.
No, that's super interesting. And so yeah, and then since then, so this kind of continued, and then much like the source theory, people were subdividing. So there's DTRN, so the redactor who's into the law. Well, there was maybe 2 of them, and then 3 prophecy redactors or whatever. So it starts doing that, and then people start seeing the Deuteronomistic influence everywhere. So they start talking about Deuteronomistic editing of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. They talk about Deuteronomistic editing of Jeremiah.
In the Odyssey.
You almost Deuteronomistic editing of you know, all sorts of like the Psalms and different prophets. And so it just gets to a point where people, they pull back and they go, enough is enough. This is too much. It can't be that the Deuteronomists wrote the entire Hebrew Bible as we have it. It doesn't really make sense. And, you know, there's Deuteronomistic language, say, in the some of the Dead Sea Scrolls material, non-biblical texts, right? So people are like, yeah, but no one's going to say that the temple scroll in at Qumran is a Deuteronomistic text, right? So you have to draw a line somewhere. So there was a backlash, and then kind of people kind of reconfiguring. I'd say the most popular viewpoint now is Romer's, Thomas Romer, who.
Before you go into it, because
sure.
I think Romer's book is, I actually just reread it. I really enjoyed it, but I want to kind of point something out just to sort of bring this back big picture to address
sure.
a question that came up earlier. I hear this a lot, and I'd like to hear your take on it. I hear a lot of people, and we've already heard it in this stream, oh, you're just saying that because you're a liberal scholar, right? You're just saying that because you hate God. And this sort of stuff comes up a lot, actually, in the circles, the YouTube circles that we now operate or whatever in. And it's silly, and I'll tell you why I think it's silly. And you've just talked about it in two different examples. Ideas in academic scholarship don't stay if they're wrong. They just don't, right? And so we first talked about, and we could talk about thousands of examples of this, but let's just talk about these two that we've talked about tonight or today. One is this JEDP Wellhousing theory, right? That by itself is a real problem for the way that I, as an evangelical fundamentalist, as a conservative fundamentalist, interpreted the Bible, right? It was a real problem because it's not Mosaic authorship. And yet, so if the goal were to be, liberal, and to disprove the Bible, nobody would fight against that, right? But they do. And European scholarship fought against it, right? There was a backlash to it because it got, to this place that was just untenable. And so there was a rethinking of it. That's how scholarship works, right? That's how academia functions, and the same thing that we're describing here that you're talking about, the Deuteronomistic history. Here we've got this idea that Noth comes up with, and people start tweaking it, and then people start finding it all over the place. And there's this backlash. Wait a minute. We've got to readdress this because this doesn't work. So this idea that there's this like scholarly Illuminati that's out there trying to just hate on God and disprove the Bible for that purpose, it's just a very unsophisticated and it's an unrealistic view. It's just a false view of how academia in particular works, right? Because look, Megan said it the other day. If we could prove that aliens founded Sumerian civilization, we'd be the first person to write a book about it because we'd be billionaires, right? We'd make all that money, right? And let me tell you, if you see the shirt I'm wearing, this is from Goodwill, right? We need that money. But no, I'm not knocking Goodwill, right? Because I got all my jackets from Goodwill. You can get $3 or $4 for a nice jacket. Okay, anyway. But I just want to put that. I'm going to continue to beat that because, I don't care, frankly, whether or not Abraham existed. Right? That doesn't affect my life at all. The only thing that I care about is what's the reality. Right? What is Abraham? Is he a patriarch? Is he like Gilgamesh, where he was a real person? Probably, but legends have built up around it. None of that matters to me personally. The only thing I care about is, what does the evidence show us, and how can we use that then to create this historical picture so that we can understand the ancient world? That's what I care about, and I'd like to have you back probably on a later stream if you'd be willing to do that, to talk about some of your personal background, because I can see people have been asking about that. Is he a Christian? Is he not? I don't want to ask you that on the spot here because I don't want you to feel like you've got a comment on that. But, this is an important point because this isn't why we do this. I don't hate God, right? Mm-hmm. I came into this kicking and screaming from God, right? So, I think that's an important thing to point out. Sorry.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And to kind of piggyback on that.
Yeah, please.
There's a fair amount of scholars who would like nothing better than for some of this to be true. There's plenty of people who are scholars of faith, but then you have to kind of set your faith aside, what you believe, when you do an academic study of anything, right? Otherwise, you're bringing your biases, right? Your faith biases into the text. So you have to. I've known plenty of people who are, men and women of faith who approach the text the same way that any scholar does, right? And so they would argue that there's, no evidence for the historical patriarchs, or they would talk about the source theory, and this is not a problem for them.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of people, if the evidence was there and we were, they would just jump. They would love it. They would love to be able to say that sort of thing. And honestly, it would make teaching easier too, because you get into classes and then people, probably some of the people with a similar mindset to, people you've interacted with YouTube, they've, grown up hearing a certain version of things. They have their faith traditions. And then when they hear something different, they really push back against that, which is fine. But, you spend a lot of time kind of butting heads because you're like having to go back and explain, well, this is why we don't think that. And this is why we don't think that. And if you could go, yep, it's all true, it would be a lot easier. So, there's no like liberal God-hating agenda. It's just you approach these texts like you approach any ancient text. That's how you do in scholarship to avoid bias, right? No one's going around saying that Gilgamesh was actually 2/3 divine, right? Even though the text says he was, right? Or that he actually, found Utnapishtim and, or that Enkidu talked to him after descending into the underworld, all this sort of thing. Like, no one thinks that actually happened.
Yeah.
And I bet most of the Christians arguing that, we have an agenda would be fine saying that didn't happen. And yet they're just two ancient texts, and that's how scholars have to treat them.
And I think before we move on to that, and I promise that I will, I remember talking with Dr. Bryson, the Egyptologist, and she's done several interviews on the Non Sequitur show. We love Maggie; she's fantastic, and of course, Dr. Reed knows her very well as well. But I remember asking her as an Egyptologist, what do you think about the Exodus? And you can see her roll her eyes because it's something that comes up as much as I'm sure the Sphinx comes up for her.
Yeah.
And she made the comment, I hope I'm okay saying this. I'm sure that I am. But she said, sometimes I think that the bias happens from the other side, right? Where people that want the Bible to be true in a certain way, and some of these events to be historical, they're phenomenal scholars in their field until they get to that critical point, and then all of a sudden this bias comes in. And she mentioned people. I won't mention their names, but they've been mentioned in the chat. Egyptologists that have been mentioned in the chat that they bring their bias to the table. And so actually, what I see, because there are a lot of people at Hopkins, a lot of professors at Hopkins that are what identify as Christians, right? And one of our great friends, won't mention his name, but one of our great friends that we both went through coursework together, evangelical Christian, right? And very strongly so. But yet, when he comes to the text, he's honest about it. And when you ask him, he'll say, yeah, my faith is subjective. It has to be, right? And I think that's the honest approach to all of this. So, okay, anyway.
Agreed.
So I derailed us, and I'm really sorry. Thank you for going off the road.
Oh, no problem. So we were just talking about developments in the Deuteronomistic history. And so it got to a point where, and like you said, it happens like this all the time in academia. Someone comes up with a really interesting idea. It seems to explain things in a new way. People go, wow, that's really great. Let me see if I can expand on that or apply it to something else. Let me see if that also works here and here and here. And then suddenly you have this kind of people keep pushing further and further to see how far the theory will go, and then it kind of rubber bands back because they go too far. And so then people go, then the critical essays come in and go, yeah, you can't really say that. You can't really say that. This doesn't make sense. This has become too big and too amorphous. It's not a real good theory anymore. And so they bring it back. So Romer is kind of one of the big proponents of, the current version of the Deuteronomistic history, which is mostly, so he also supports 3 redaction layers, not unlike the Smin school, but dates them differently. So he says there's one in the Assyrian period, i.e. the monarchic Israel, one in the Neo-Babylonian period, i.e. in exile, and then one in the Persian period.
And where does he say the majority of the editing takes place?
Well, the majority has to take place in the exile and after. So, most of it comes from later. Almost always when you have these kind of layered things, I mean, by its very nature, the first layer is the smallest.
And so, just as a side note, so everybody can see, the book that we're talking about, because it came up in the side chat, is the so-called Deuteronomistic History by Thomas Romer. It's T&T Clark, published, so 2010, 12, something like that. 7.
Oh, yours is 7?
Well,
yeah.
It's like originally it was published in hardback in 2005, but anyway, you got the right one.
It's a great book. I have mine.
And it's and it's not a long read.
And, no, and it's not. I mean, wouldn't say it's necessarily written to a wider audience, but it's not so like geared just to scholars. Yeah. I think it's geared to scholars in many fields, and so it's a bit more relatable and presentable than some of the scholarly arguments go. So I'd say his is probably, I'd say somewhere between his and Cross's view, because I think Cross, that Josianic original with an exilic edition, editing, between Romer and that, those are probably the most common approaches. I find a lot of people still kind of lean towards that Cross approach, because it makes a lot of sense. There's other outside factors for dating, so it's not just it focuses on Josiah, so it has to be pre-exilic, but people point to the curses of Deuteronomy 28 and also Deuteronomy 13 and compare them to the succession treaty of Esarhaddon, and parallels between that, which puts it also right in the monarchic period.
Can you talk about that for just a second, maybe?
Sure. So the laws, the Mosaic laws in Deuteronomy, end with a series of blessings and curses. Blessings, obviously, if you obey the laws; curses if you disobey them. So there's the blessings are, there's a few verses, and then it's a whole mess of curses.
And we see this also in Leviticus 26.
Yeah, precisely. And so some of these curses are very reminiscent. So Esarhaddon's succession treaty, it's a Neo-Assyrian treaty that was given to all sorts of Assyrian provinces and vassals and that sort of thing, that they would have to swear basically to be loyal to the new king.
Right. So Esarhaddon is an Assyrian king.
Yes.
And he has this tablet this text written up, this treaty, and we have duplicates of it. Actually, Professor Jake Lowinger is our Acadian professor at Hopkins, did tons and tons of work on this. And thus we did tons and tons of work on it, but it was sent out, right, to, as you said, these vassals to swear fealty, right, to swear that they were going to, obey. And of course, the text had a series of curses attached to it, as treaties did. So the comparison then is made, between
the curses in this treaty, which has a definite, historical date, and the curses in Deuteronomy 28. So they're usually one of the parade examples. I think it's Deuteronomy 28, 23, where it talks about the sky being
as bronze,
and then the ground being iron, which also we see. Okay, it is 23. Fantastic. Which corresponds to a similar section, curse in Esarhaddon's succession treaty, where again the ground is iron, the sky is bronze, and that's lines 528 and following and you're dealing with a long tablet when it's 500 plus lines.
Right.
So yeah, there's other similarities. And so people say, the argument goes, people like Levinson and Stamens and others, Weinfeld, have argued that this represents kind of a subversive take on this treaty, right? Like that Judah might have had to, he as a vassal had to swear this kind of fealty and Gesundheit, and and the Deuteronomistic writer, or the writer of Deuteronomy anyways, playing with that, says, oh no, we're not swearing fealty to an Assyrian king, but we're going to use that language to talk about swearing fealty to Yahweh our God, as a subversive element. So yeah, that's another thing for dating. Comparisons have been made with Joshua's campaign stories and Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, where they talk about the kings conquering certain areas. So there's certain
Lawson Younger wrote his dissertation on that.
Yeah. So,
and Lawson Younger, just so that everybody knows, is an evangelical scholar at Trinity Trinity Seminary. I mean, he's not a God hater. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. So, there are reasons other than the Josianic references to tie this to the monarchic period. Granted, there are people who push against that just on every view, right? There's people who want to date the whole thing, much like Noth, to the exilic period.
Well, let me do this, because I'm looking at the time. Megan just texted me. She said we have exactly 14.5 billion questions.
That's a lot of questions.
Not to intimidate you, because I know you can answer every one of them. I think Epic Christ has asked 3 million of them, which is just kidding. But it's 1:30. I know I told you I wouldn't go any more than 2 hours, and I'm
fine taking questions.
Okay. So Megan, did you want to maybe bring them in? Would that be the easiest way to do this? There's this 5-second delay, so I have to wait the 5 seconds before she hears it. I tell you what can we, William, I'm going to walk out there and look. What can you talk about for the next 2 minutes?
Well, I have more that I could say about the Deuteronomistic history.
Yeah, maybe give a good summation. Can you give a good summation of it? Oh, wait a minute.
Beyond what I've done?
No.
Are you saying I didn't do a good job, which is possible?
That's the question list.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So
questions are here.
Yeah, the questions are here. Okay. All right. Here we go. See.
Okay.
You're off the hook here. You don't have to do an even better job than what you've already done. Xanos Carthage asks, "What's your favorite weapon?"
So ancient. Well, I'm going to assume ancient weapon. I mean, I'm partial to the sword just because that's part of. I was writing about Yahweh's sword. I think the kind of sickle type swords that are known actually from the late Bronze Age are actually pretty cool, even if they're a bit unwieldy.
What is that? Well, I'm trying to remember the book that we read talked about the new weapon that was developed that brought about the fall.
Yeah, that's Robert Drew's. He talks about the Bronze Age collapse circa 1200.
It's like the Nang 2 something.
The Naue 2 sword, right? It's a straight sword, and so right the sickle sword, or what was called in Egyptian the hapesh sword, was kind of like curved, and it was actually, at least people think, was developed from like an axe. It's a good kind of bashing weapon. It's and a little bit of slashing, but it's really bad for stabbing, thrusting. So these Naue 2 swords, or they're straight swords. They're way better for stabbing and slashing. You can put them in a sheath, so they're easier to carry than the sickle swords. But it wasn't just the swords. I mean, Drew's argument is that they had better armor, and they had javelins that they could throw. And then, of course, the late Bronze Age kingdoms are focusing on chariot warfare. And if you bring a bunch of javelins and straight swords to a chariot fight, you're going to be able to disrupt the chariots.
Also the aliens. So
sure, why not?
All right. Beej Price asked, "I'd like to know how people wrote down everything Abraham did, said, where he went, who with, 1,800 years after he supposedly existed? I think that's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I think that they didn't. Granted, there will undoubtedly be oral traditions
Sure.
about the ancestors, and the studies on oral traditions say that there's a flexibility built in, which is why details can change. What they change things to suit the audience, right?
Yeah.
You can be flexible in doing that. So.
And this, we have, this is one of the things that I think Gilgamesh represents such a good example of this, just because, not just because he's, from my field,
But it helps.
we have early evidence for him as a person, but yet certainly these are legends that have built up around him, and so it's not terribly. I don't think anybody would argue that, oh man, we have an inscription, that shows Gilgamesh as a king. Therefore, we know that all the stuff that's said about him is true, about him conquering Huwawa and throwing a leg bone of the bull of heaven. I mean, a thigh of the bull of heaven up at Ishtar or Inanna. It's like, what? Nobody would do that.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, that something was discovered that, Abraham was a real person, right? I mean, like that doesn't do anything, right? I mean, it's like, okay.
So it does. I mean, there are, right, the minimalists who say that basically the entire Hebrew Bible was written in the Hellenistic period, and that it's all just things that people made up to tell themselves, and there's no historical evidence or even like reflection or echo in there. So what it would do for them is to say, well, not so fast, which is the same for the Tel Dan Stele that had the Beit David, the House of David reference on it. So it gives you an idea that, yeah, maybe there was a historical Abraham, and maybe some of the stuff might be tales told about him, but it doesn't confirm that everything that happened in Genesis, exactly right, happened. It just confirms that there was a historical Abraham. That's something worth knowing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would love if that were true. If we could find something like that, that'd be fantastic. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, everything that's attributed to him happened.
Right. Are there two Exodus stories?
Yeah, there's usually a P and a non-P, if you take the traditional scholarly approach to the Exodus. I haven't looked at it in a lot of detail, so I'm blanking on where they would divide on what elements. But yeah, there's a P and a non-P.
Cool. Silhouette asks, were the Israelites an offshoot of the Canaanites? And would there be good evidence of Canaanite teachings, beliefs in the Bible?
So that is certainly one scholarly approach, is to say, and that's say William Dever, prominent archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein, another Israeli, he's Israeli, not William Dever, archaeologists both view the Israelites as an offshoot, or just basically Canaanites. Mm-hmm. I think there's good evidence that, and certainly some of the religious practices, at least when you come into certain motifs, right, like the storm god imagery, talked about some of that stuff in connection with Baal and Ugarit, is the same. It's the same language. So they're pulling, even if they're not Canaanites, they're pulling from Canaanite kind of ideas and mythology that was just around, that would have been like common knowledge at the time. So, I mean, I don't have a horse in the race, so I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say they were or they weren't. I think there's, evidence that archaeologically, the evidence is that they are. Textually, then you get into Emic versus Edic kind of, talking about whether, we privilege what an outsider says about them or what they say about themselves. My personal theory is that a lot of the tribes are probably an amalgamation of lots of people that ended up in that land. Some may have come from like Midian, maybe even Egypt. Some probably Canaanites fleeing, sea peoples circa 1200, fleeing to the hill country. and that they may have forged an identity together. But
Yeah.
I'm willing to go.
It's
a
not
different way.
easy to figure out.
No, it's not, and it's not my area of specialty,
Sure.
so I defer to other specialists.
Yeah, I fall prey to this as well when I end up talking to you. I end up asking you anything and everything about the Hebrew Bible that I want to, and it's not fair, and I apologize for that.
Oh, that's fine. You don't have to apologize. It comes with the territory.
Skeptical Christian says, would you be able to ask 2 questions during the question period for me? 1, what is the most compelling linguistic evidence showing the Torah uses later Hebrew?
One of the compelling pieces of evidence is just the narrative tense, sometimes called the Vav Tol or the Vav consecutive, is a narrative device that you don't really see in archaic Hebrew. It's not really. I mean, there's arguments about whether or not it exists in Ugaritic, but I think largely the consensus is that it doesn't. Okay. And so this is kind of a feature of later Hebrew. You can also look at different uses of the perfect tense, and whether it's being used in kind of what we think of as a past tense, a simple past tense, versus a wider range of usage in the archaic. There's also like the use of the et particle, or that marks the direct object being absent. Sometimes that comes into play, especially when you're dealing with something that's more narrative.
And they wanted to know the best books on this.
Best books. Let's see. I'm looking. I'm just trying to find the right place on my shelf. I have these.
Okay. And while he's looking, I mean, one of the things, Dr. Reed, that I think you would hopefully agree on, and I'm sure I know that you would, is that I was asking Megan last night how to it's so tough to balance in a forum like this, managing expectations of people, right? So I mean, like you and I have gone through, and Megan has gone through, and Dr. Bryson, and we've all gone through this like crazy amounts of training, specialized training in this field, in these different fields. And so because of that, when people ask us questions, to answer some of these questions, it's like, I need you for 3 years to answer that adequately. And you can't do that because, that's, well, I mean, you can, I suppose, but people, they won't hang out for 3 years. But that means that when for those of you that are watching that are lay people, which is fantastic. Like I'd be a lay person when it comes to biology and evolution and stuff, and I'm interested in it, but I'm not going to go to school for it, right? I have to realize that when I go talk to a molecular biologist or an evolutionary biologist or something, if I go read a book on molecular or evolutionary biology, that doesn't mean that I'm now have a PhD in it, right? And that I'm somehow going to be able to go toe to toe with that person. And so I have to manage the expectation. I have to say, okay, there are things that I can learn and I can go so far, but I'm going to ultimately have to rely on what these scholars in the field say. And I just think that's a really important thing to remember when you're coming up against a position that is considered to be the majority consensus view on something like evolution, let's say. I think it's foolish to come at that as a layperson if you don't think, if you're going against something like biological evolution, or whatever the technical term would be for it, to come against that as a layperson, it's just a little arrogant, and I think fraught with difficulties for you and for the person you're talking to, because they're going to want to, in order to prove something to you at that level, it's sometimes the arguments have to become very detailed and require you to have this basic knowledge and background that you probably don't have, right? And so anyway, I think that's important for all of us to keep in mind when we interact like this. Anyway.
So one book I would recommend is A History of the Hebrew Language by Science Badillos. I'm probably butchering that last name. So that's one. Gar has a dialect geography book called Dialect Geography of Syria Palestine 1000 to 586 BCE. So that's Randall Gar, Garr. Seth Sanders, this is maybe a little more tangential, but has a history of or the invention of Hebrew. So that's Seth Sanders. And then Always Good, although I'm not sure this would cover exactly that, so maybe it's not a great resource, but Vandertorn's Scribal Culture and the Making of the Hebrew Bible.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Megan snuck in to tell me that she's putting more questions in my texts. I have a bunch here from Epic Christ. I'll pick some of the, let's see. That one we answered. Sorry.
That's fine.
Let's see. Okay, why would stylistic variation matter in the Bible when biographical inscription of uni is not regarded as multiple authorship? I don't understand that question. Okay, what are your thoughts on Daniel 11? Is that the statue?
I think so. I'd have to double check. Daniel is definitely outside of my normal wheelhouse.
Daniel 11. Warring Kings. Sorry.
No, I'm scanning through it too. I'm just trying to see what the connection is.
I'm assuming that the question is this is a very detailed prophecy that ostensibly came true. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so not to discount it completely, but anytime you have a prophecy, especially one that you can't put a date on, right? So there's issues about dating any book of the Bible, right? Because we don't have originals, that sort of thing. We don't even have like copies that are even close to what we might consider original. So there's a thing called an ex eventu prophecy, where the prophecy is created after the event so that it gets to like look correct. And we know about those from, Egyptian, certain Egyptian prophecies we know to be ex eventu. And so just like the kind of like naming of Josiah as the person who would destroy the altar in Bethel seems like more specific than you ever hear any like prophecy. If you read, say, the Mari prophecies or the Neo-Assyrian prophecies.
They show up in historical omens. I mean, this is not a rare ancient Near Eastern phenomenon.
It happens all the time. And so I would say sometimes a prophecy that detailed and specific actually makes you more suspicious. And the fact that we can't date Daniel exactly makes it hard for us not to say, right, that it's not after the fact.
Yeah. Roger that. Can Dr. William, let's see, Brant 53, watching, can Dr. William Reed believe so many are interested in these things?
Can I believe so many people are interested? I hope they are.
Yeah, there you go. Isn't one of the reasons that J-source was identified as originating from much later than originally thought because of the discoveries about when camels were domesticated?
So that is more often a factor on just kind of the general accuracy of the patriarch narratives. I mean, obviously they do mention camels. I'd say that certainly plays into it. Another aspect, I mean, you could say that could be something that might have been touched up later if you really were committed to the 10th century. I don't think very many people are, and that is definitely a hallmark of why the patriarchal narratives are at least suspicious, right? But a good reason to date J later. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. There's probably 20 more questions. You are very popular, my friend, and I am not surprised in any way. So I'll ask maybe two more,
Sure.
and then I think we're just gonna have to have you come back on. If you're
sure,
willing.
Yeah, I'd be glad to come back.
I think, yeah, I'm not surprised at all. We've got 54 people, I think, watching right now. This is, and by the way, if you're watching and you like what you see, please subscribe, like the video, share it out on your whatever you share things on. I really need to learn what social media entails.
Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
There you go. All the see, Dr. Reed's up on it. He's up on it. Okay. Compelled unbeliever. Is it a good theory that at least some Canaanites moved toward Lower Egypt and returned many generations later in a slow migration as new Hebrews?
It's certainly possible, right? There's a lot of traffic between Egypt and Canaan, especially in the Bronze Age, but even going back before that, they would come down for a number of reasons, and fitting with the biblical story, sometimes if there's a famine or economic hardship, they would flee to Egypt for a time. But we also know that especially New Kingdom pharaohs, such as Thutmose III and on, they campaigned pretty heavily in Palestine to keep the population down, in reaction to the Hyksos invasion, prior to the New Kingdom, the Hyksos invasion. And so they were taking Canaanite slaves constantly.
You think about it during the Amarna period, this is one of the areas it's fought over, but Egypt is, these are vassals of Egypt, right?
Yeah, precisely. And so they would be able to come down for an audience with the king, that sort of thing. So I would say that's certainly a good place to start with. They came down and maybe migrated back. Some of them might not have ever left Canaan, right? This is the archaeological viewpoint. And some might have actually been slaves that escaped, but, in small numbers, and may have gone up through Midian, or some might have been just Midianites, right? There's a lot of Yahwistic traditions that seem to hearken to that Edomite area, that Taman area. So some people think that Yahwistic worship actually came from Midian and then was influenced or influenced the religion in Palestine.
Awesome. Well, there's one more. It's not a question, but it's a statement. And Dirk Dobbins says that William needs his own channel.
That seems very unlikely to happen at this point.
I'm just picturing Veronica's face right now. That's what I'm doing.
I'm much happier at this point to just contribute to yours.
Oh, well, I really, really appreciate that, because, this is, we got 56 people watching right now. And I just, I can't thank all of you enough for watching. This is a Saturday afternoon. Out of the 56 people, we have 40 likes, which I'm not like a YouTube expert or anything, but that's a lot. You are a very liked individual, and no dislikes. So you can't beat that. So I guess let's we'll just have to have you back on. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. There were a lot of good ones. I think it would have gone over time, and I really appreciate everybody watching. And we will have him back on, and we'll get those other questions in. But I guess, do you have any closing thoughts, just very generally here, on if somebody did want to start to look more into this JDP, source criticism, documentary hypothesis, the Deuteronomistic history, is there one book that you would point them to? Because there are a lot.
Yeah, there are a lot. I'm trying to think of something that would be geared towards.
I know that Hess's introduction,
yeah,
is decent for that.
Yeah, I think Ska might be a little outdated in the fact that I don't think he has the neo-documentarians in there, but Ska's introduction to reading the Pentateuch.
Actually, just got that about a month and a half ago.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, it is a good book.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward. Not too tedious, because like the Farewell to the Yah is if you don't already know what's going on, it's a terrible read, because they drop you into in the middle of this very complicated debate about whether you can categorize non-P as J, and then like minute divisions between P and non-P, that sort of thing, and it can be a difficult read, I think, for someone who doesn't have the basic foundation.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Reed, I can't thank you enough. You've done a phenomenal job on here, and people love you. And I think you have an amazing history and phenomenal educational background. And of course, you're an amazing human being. I know you very well. So, I thank you for taking the time to come on here and really share the abundance of your knowledge with us. And I say none of that in jest. I mean, I really admire you, and I admire. I taught Dr. Reed a little bit of Akkadian at one point at Hopkins, and my best student. I mean, like hands down. And it wasn't even his. It wasn't even his field. So he's just a brilliant scholar. And when you publish a popular book, I really hope that you do. I encourage everybody to buy it, because it's going to be great. He's got a vast wealth of information. So we'll go ahead and close out. Tonight at 7:30, we will have our third stream in the marathon of streaming. And we're going to be going through our Digital Hammurabi book club. Going through it. We're going to have another episode of our Digital Hammurabi book club. We're going to be reading through the Babylonian Job, right? The Akkadian Job. It's the Lodel Baal Namaki, the poem of the Righteous Sufferer. And we're also going to read the instructions of Shurupak and Sumerian, and also the very funny and amazing story, the three ox drivers of Adab. But we're going to have Skylar Fiction on, who is an amazing character. And if you haven't visited his channel and subscribed to it, I really would recommend it. He's an amazing guy. And so it's going to be a good time. So 7:30 tonight, be back here. And again, thank you, Dr. Reed, for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. You've said a great many kind words about me. So it was a privilege to come on and talk. So I appreciate it, and I look forward to coming back again in the future.
Well, thank you, and you deserve every bit of the compliments. So we look forward to it. Well, thank you all for watching. And as we always say, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Thanks.